Yeah, Tim, can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, let me see if I can move this around. Okay, yeah, great. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure today to share with you kind of my old research in my PhD study on the geology and tectonics in the Qaidam Basin that is in the northern margin of the Tibetan Plateau. The talk today, this is outline my talk. I'll start with the regional geology and introduction about the Qaidam Basin. Then I'll try to characterize the basement involved structural wedges deformation style in the basin. And building on that, I will try to define the structural architecture of that basin. And with that, I'll then expand into discussion of deformation timing, and then the implication for all of this study into understanding the regional tectonics. So for those of you who are not familiar with where we are, Qaidam Basin is located in the northern margin of the Tibetan Plateau, which is one of the largest tectonic features on the Earth. The plateau itself formed as a result of the collision between India and Eurasia that started from the Cenozoic time period. So if we can just like think about a cartoon explanation of the formation of the plateau, if you compare the Asia plate as a larger size truck, while India was still far away from it, let's say here, this is 100 million years ago, India was a smaller sized car that is moving northward towards Asia. By about 15 million years ago, the exact time still being debated, but this is roughly the start, like the collision when India started colliding with Asia, starting forming the high mountains in the Himalayas, and also with the plateau being uplifting since then. The collision continued uphill against now, where you can actually say that, both the Himalaya and also like the high plateau itself, including some of the mountain range further even outside the plateau proper itself, like further to the north. All of these are affected by the India-Eurasia collision. So understanding of the basin, which is like the Qaidam Basin in the northern part of this plateau, will help us understand how constrained the tectonic history of this broader plateau deformation. Here is the elevation map based on the kind of the SRTM data, kind of 30-meter resolution data, where you can get a general impression of the general topography of the basin, where as shown here, like the bluish color, the greenish color are the shallower elevation, are the kind of lower relief, while the light color are the higher relief here. So generally, you see kind of the basin itself is a triangular shaped basin, where you got the mountain belts bounding the basin itself. While this mountain belts also corresponds with a series like a fault system. So to the northwest basin, you got the Altentag range, which actually corresponds with this left lateral structural fault, the Altentag fault. The fault itself is a very large structural fault, depending on where you can correlate. It's ranging from 300 kilometers to 600 kilometers for left lateral structural movement. While to the south, you got another left lateral structural fault called the Eastern Quinlan fault, corresponding again with the mountain range here. So both of these bounding faults kind of are defining, as I will introduce that later, how the basin is deformed. To the southwest basin, you got the Kinematics range. There is mainly thrust faults that are deep into the southwest. While to the northeastern side, you see there's a potentially larger mountain range system called the Qilian range here, where there are some more studies, really defining how far the Altentag fault extends towards the eastern side. But at least from the topography map, you see more or less topography disappears towards this northeastern corner. So more or less a lot of the displacement from the left lateral displacement converts into some of the thrust tectonics here. So here in this mountain range, it's mainly northeast DP. Within the basin itself, you also got an internal mountain range, which I will show a line through this range later. But internally, you got I will zoom in on some of the elevation map. But you got some of the very well defined Cenozoic faults that can be clearly imaged on the elevation map. So as I mentioned, the collision between the India and Eurasia is still happening. So this is still active tectonics ongoing. So what I showed here is the beach ball corresponding with the major earthquake larger than size 5 based on the Harvard CMT catalog up until like late 2010s. So this actually shows like inside of the basin, you can see it's dominantly throughout contractional earthquake system. While along with the structural fault system, you see majority of them are kind of like a structural fault, but internally you also got some of the contractional related earthquakes. One of the major ones that happened is like that purple beach ball that's like close to 7.9 magnitude earthquake. Here is the elevation profile, starting from the India plain across the Himalaya into the plateau and further expanding into the Qaidam Basin, where you can see that overall, the Tibetan Plateau itself is more or less like its lower relief change is about 5,000 meters or 16,000 feet of average elevation, while the Qaidam Basin itself is about 2,700 meters elevation or 9,000 feet of elevation. So the basin itself, even though it's still probably one of the highest basins, like that has oil and gas exploration, so top to work in, but the basin itself is kind of like the lowest spot within the plateau. So it was able to accumulate the Cenozoic sediments while the plateau was still uplifting, kind of recording the geologic history in this part of the plateau. So this is a geologic map, just covering like the main part of the basin and also the nearby mountain ranges. So generally the light color, including both from the white to the yellow, are the younger sediments from mainly in the Cenozoic time period, where you can see the basin itself is mainly covered by the Cenozoic, including some of the quaternary sediments here. The kind of like the black lines are the fold axis. So overall, there are like about 140 anticlines that are formed within this basin, dominantly in the kind of like in the northern side, in the northern half of the basin. While the dark colors are the older rock, including some of the rarely you have some of the Mesozoic sediments here, but mainly like outside the basin, it's more like a Pre-Jurassic or even some of the basement rock here. This is kind of like a very simplified sequence description of the basin, where you can see that it's mainly Cenozoic lacustrine sedimentary environment. Starting from the deeper side, you got some conglomerate, but it's mainly like sandstone, like shales, or even like some of the interlayers throughout the basin. There are actually good documentation with this basin sequence, both from the industry wells and also some of the field studies. So this is showing kind of like a field image. You can actually see that how dry it is currently, but overall, like it's very nearly complete Cenozoic sediment sequence. So within this basin, you got like a multiple hydrocarbon system, both the source rock and the reservoir rock. So PetroChina has been operating in this basin for quite a few decades, and they actually indeed made quite a few decent discoveries in the past few years, building upon their exploration history. It's mainly, but there are still part of the basin still not very well understood, mainly because of the complexity of the basin. But with this industry efforts there, combined with some of the surface geology, we are able to really help us constrain our understanding of the basin subsurface architecture. So here I'm showing you just one example line of the seismic data that we use. This is one regional line, 2D, like a 2D seismic section. I got more data in this research, which I didn't show, but there are like more detailed 2D lines, or sometimes you got 3D data coverage here. But overall, in this talk, I will be showing some of the regional lines and some of the details we interpret the structures here. This is actually the only line I'm showing with the vertical exaggeration. This is like a 4:1, but besides except for this one, all the seismic I'll be showing in this talk will be 1:1. So you can see that, like, just to highlight with this vertical exaggeration, you can see that the center part of the basin is much deeper and much thicker than the margin of the basin, where you got like a ton of deformation seems to be happening. And, you got clearly see some of the anticlines here, which some of them has been tested by the exploration wells. So with this, the motivation of our study in this area was first to understand this complex structure style and the timing of deformation in this basin. We also want to develop, based on the identification of some of the basement involved structural styles, we want to develop some of the structural modeling capabilities, both from the cross-section based and also from the map-based tools to analyze these complex structural styles. And finally, we also want to analyze the process that drives deformation in this basin and to understand tectonic implications. Of course, I'm not going to cover in detail about this, but this study also has the implications for guiding some of the hydrocarbon exploration efforts in the basin. Moving next, I'll try to characterize as I mentioned, the basement involved structural style in this basin, particularly like the structural wedges. First, I want to show again, like this is the regional line one-to-one scale, and mainly in the western side of the basin. And as I zoom in, you will see, and I'll put like some of the stratigraphy here, where it's still not that high scale, but I will walk into the detail. Where you can see that the shallow events are very well constrained. The deeper event, this is actually the top of the basement. So here on the western margin of the basin, it's very thinner Cenozoic sediments, where we can actually clearly define the top of the basement. You can see there's a displacement across the top of the basement here. So this is actually, if you compare the geometry of that fault geometry, this is an example I found in Newfoundland in Canada while doing a field trip there, where you can see that you got the hanging wall, and that is actually deformed, even the very front part is overturned. While in the footwall, you also got a little bit of deformation there. On this kind of outcrop scale, you can clearly define the fault geometry based on the displacement, also the fault architecture. Similarly, even though we cannot really see that on the seismic, you can really, based on the fault geometry, constrain the fault geometry by the fault relationships. So this is comparable to typical fault propagation folding, but this is kind of this is the way that I try to model the structure was more combination with the tri-share algorithm, because you do see the footwall also being deformed. So the way that we can model this was really trying to constrain that shallow fault geometry. This is the final interpretation. But just to walk you through how we can forward model the structure deformation. This is the initial setup with deeper fault that start to propagate upward with some of the pro-growth strata. As the fault started to propagating upward and also the growth strata being deposited, you start to form the fault geometry above it, as well as the deformation happening in the front limb. As the fault propagates upwards, the structure continues to grow, and eventually, actually, we can match the shallow geometry. So it's really a very quick example, simple example, where we can use the very well constrained shallow geometry based on some of the observation of the fault relationship. We can try to constrain the deeper fault geometry. So this is an example where we could start documenting this basement involved structures. And next, I will walk you through how we can apply this learning to further build upon this to define structural wedge. Structural wedge is a geometry where you have a forward thrust and a back thrust that are connected through this wedge tip point. Basically, you got the fault that are this is contractional environment, where you have this basically the wedge shape that are being pushed towards upward. So basically, this wedge tip is the deformation front, where outside it you don't have much deformation, but it's really internally both within that that wedge block and also the section above it, you got major deformation happening. So this is the wedge system is not that unique, because even in the very historical wedge experiment, you start forming those conjugate static force. So this conjugate static force form typical Coulomb failure criterion. It's really when you have one system that starts to dominate, and you can start to have if one becomes the forward thrust, the other becomes the back thrust. So basically, the displacement initially comes from the forward thrust, and then actually would go backward towards the back thrust. Again, this is an example I found in West Canada in the Rocky Mountains. Let me put the interpretation in, and then I will also put the force. But then before I do that, you already noticed that actually corresponding with some of the southern white ones, you can actually already start defining some of the fault system here. So in this scenario, you got that forward thrust in the deeper side, and here actually there are two back thrust coming from the system. And internally within the wedge system, there are not only folding deformation because of the geometry of that fault shape, but also you got potentially some of the further internal deformation happening here. This is a kind of like a very simple classroom sandbox model that I run for our teaching activities. And so here is like, you got a sandpaper beneath it that are dragging the sediments against like that backstop. As I started, contracting the system, you started forming like, a series of those fault thrusts. But then as you move like to the center side, you see again, there's a fault thrust, there's a back thrust. As I continue the deformation, you actually see that, there are beyond those fault thrusts, you actually got series back thrusts in this system. So overall, this kind of like a wedge structure or the, sometimes called the triangle zone are not that unusual. Lots of this stuff have been documented in some of the global basins, both from the Alberta or like, in California and some of the Pyrenees studies. But most of these wedge structures are thin-skinned system, meaning that they do not involve the basement. The structural wedges in a thick-skinned system are less well documented. And here in the Qaidam Basin, again, coming back to the seismic, and we have the opportunity to really constrain this basement-involved structural wedges. So here we're coming to the northern side of the basin, where again I got like the elevation map, where you can clearly see that those structures are still very well constrained by this surface relief, because these are cenozoic structures, and then they are still very well preserved in the surface. So you can tell like there are a bunch of like linear structures. There are some like less linear but more rounded shape. So I'm showing you first example of one line across that linear structure, where clearly you can, if we start from the shallow side, that is like a better image and better constraint in terms like the folding and faulting relationship. You see, you can define that like a fault F1 here, where you can see that you got the folding above it. But then if you look at the footwall of that shallower fault, on regional scale, actually that footwall is higher than the hanging wall side. This typical age is roughly 40 million years ago, and so in order to constrain really what's happening here, the way we try to analyze the folding fault relationship is try to utilize the horizon relief analysis. So this is kind of like the side from the left side to the right side is getting younger in terms of the exact layer, and I'll come back to talk about the per-growth of the growth. But basically, the graded layer, like from T4 to T2, basically, the blue up until that yellow one, these are the per-growth strata that are more or less isopachus. And where you can actually see that when you plot the relief difference using these three reference points, one coming from the center of that crystal point, the other two control points are coming from that outside that deformation zone. So you can actually plot this relief difference, and then they definitely the highlight is that the relief difference for 1 to 1 minus 3, basically the hanging wall of that shallow fault minus the relief of the that footwall side. You see it's negative because like it's deeper here. And so based on this observation from the data, we try to explain kind of like the shallow geometry first. In order to explain the shallow geometry, there are multiple ways that you can produce that shallow folding geometry. It's either like a typical thin skin fault propagation folding, where you can generate that shallower folding geometry, or you could still be like a thick skinned fault propagation folding, generating that. Alternatively, if you're like initial like a normal fault that would later invert to the thrust fault, you can still generate some of the similar like shallow folding geometry. And finally, this is the model for the like a wedge system, having like a basement involved wedge system where you can still generate the shallow geometry. It's really kind of like this different like end member models. It's the deeper part that are different across each other, and correspondingly, we will plot the same like a relief difference plotting, starting from the deeper layer into the shallow layer. You can actually see dramatic difference in terms of the patterns. So for the both like the typical single fault propagation folding, all of the relief from that like a crystal point is much higher because like that's absorbing the deformation. While like if you got like the invariant structure, the hanging wall is actually lower in the deeper sequence because like the initial drop down from the normal fault. It's really like this wedge basement involved wedge structures that shows this unique style that, in the deeper side, the hanging wall is lower than the footwall from that shallower fault. But coming into the shallower event, it's actually coming getting to a lower difference. So it's with this kind of plotting building from this end member model that we can compare this end member model with our actual data, where we can actually do constrain that there's a deeper fault geometry. This example we can actually also see potentially some of the displacement, but it's really how you constrain that fault geometry. That's kind of we can try to use this plotting to identify the potential existence of this F2. And then, we did more detailed work in terms of kinematics to really constrain that deeper fault geometry, because with the image quality, you cannot really define the fault geometry directly from the seismic. It's really with the combination of the kinematics we try to define this fault geometry. So the way I tried to model this was basically using the MOVE software. Here I'm using the algorithm of the inclined shear because of the complexity of the fault geometry. But this is actually more geometric approximation if you pick the shear angle carefully to help us constrain the fault geometry, basically trying to model the simple shear deformation along the axial surface here. I won't go into the detail, but really the way that we model the kinematics, we're trying to test the sweet number of parameter setup. For example, including the initial fault geometry setup, the inclined shear angle selection, or the final wedge tip location, as well as the amount of the displacement you apply, and then how that relates to the relief, depending on the fault dip angle. And also in this example, you got both the per growth and growth strata. So it's really defining the deformation timing and applying the growth strata into the modeling process. So basically, I tested a series of numbers of parameters and try to find the best fit example. So this is kind of one of the closer match with the seismic. So the initial setup, you got that full thrust and you got the back thrust. This is the initial wedge tape point. And as I started compacting the deformation, you start to see that the wedge tape propagates forward, while eventually this displacement still goes back along that back thrust. While internally, you start to see within the wedge system there are some deformation happening. As I continue the deformation, you see that both the section above the wedge and within the wedge is continuing deforming. And in this unique structure, because of the fault architecture, eventually actually you need to have the fault that actually breaks through to a shallow or higher angle. Eventually combined with this, in combination with the growth strata, you try to reproduce the structure here. So based on this understanding, we can document this new type of structural style, this basement involved structural wedge. And starting from the shallow observation and also trying to understand the relief difference to really constrain this fault geometry. So we try to develop the structural modeling capabilities to really model this complex system. And we can then apply this similar learning to other structures nearby. Again, the previous example was showing from this northern structure, but this is another structure, again, even more complex than the one that I showed earlier. But we can really apply these insights from that single structure, initial model building to other more complex one. So again, here we can analyze the relief difference, and then combined with the shallower better constraint geometry, we can really constrain this interpretation. Even though you don't really see much happening in the basement, to explain that shallower fault geometry or some of the shallower fault geometry, you really need some of the deeper fault to be there. So basically, you got this is actually a duplex duplex structural wedge. So here you got a deeper basement involved rooted fault thrust, and you got that back thrust extending to the system. But along that back thrust, you can actually form in that shallower duplex wedge system, again, complicating the structural style. So this is kind of more structural prospect style, single anticlines style structure interpretation, and then we can apply this learning into more regional scale. So this is again the area that I mentioned very briefly, which is called the Hill Range in the southwestern side of the basin. where you see kind of like, it's much higher elevation compared with the other part of the basin. And then the red polygons are the location of the discovered oil fields in this part of the basin. So again, this is one line across that hero range. This is actually a combined line from the 2D regional one, along with like line extraction from the 3D data, seismic data. So you can see that the 3D is actually better quality. That's why we try to combine the data when we have them available. So just more details, like zooming in on this seismic section, where you see a lot of like detailed deformation happening within across this small mountain range. And the way that then I will try to walk you through how I did the interpretation, like starting from the shallower, better constrained fault geometry, and try to really build the deeper fault geometry constraint. So before doing that, I first define the axial surface. These are kind of like the fixed surface that are separate in the different deep domains. And then, like this is the shallower event that are more or less well constrained, both from the seismic and some of the well control here. So you can say that already from this like one single line, you can notice some of the fault geometry that are defining the displacement here. So piece by piece, I will try to walk through like how we constrain that. So first, starting from that western that left segment, you can define the shallower fault geometry up until like to this point. But that means that either is extending along this like a detachment, which we'll cover later. But then really like beneath that shallower thrust fault, you got more deformation in that footwall side. So that's why like even though you cannot really directly constrain that only from the seismic, based on the fault-fold relationship, we can really constrain that deeper fault geometry to explain the deformation going on here. Again, similar story for that, like that part where you have that footwall of that shallower thrust fault that has deformation, and we can start to constrain that that deeper piece of the thrust fault, and that actually comes to the similar to the semi-interval where that fault potentially sows to. So that's where actually combined with the shallow geometry again, we can constrain that this is kind of more the detachment level, but really piecing together the fault geometry here. Again, coming to the right side of this section, starting from the shallower, shallower fault geometry, you start to explain that based on some of the observation of the fault geometry and how those relate to the shallower fault geometry. So then, again, piecing together the story combined with some of the better image zone and also the potential detachment layer, you connect the system into like starting from the shallow all the way deeper. Again, look at on the regional level. You see that you got that large thrust fault, you got that single basement involved thrust fault. But on the regional level, you see that section is still higher than this right side on regional level. So that's why that we did some other fault deeper in the basement in order to explain that shallower fault geometry and also to explain where the displacement comes from. So again, like this is similar to what I described some of the wedge system. And again, to point out that this is actually where we'll apply those learning from the wedge observation. This is where the wedge tip point connects to like the forefront of that axial surface that separates like that deformation above the wedge and also no deformation forward. So this is kind of the system that we try to build and then try to define the details here. After defining all of this detail, we can also analyze the slip amount, where you can actually have you can analyze the initial slipping partition from the initial displacement coming from that main thrust fault, all the way extending from the basement, and then that slips that kind of splits into the different system. So where we can actually this marks the displacement across the different fault system, but eventually this all comes from that deeper fault. So with this, we build like kinematically viable and balanced cross section, and then kind of apply the same knowledge into the zone where into more the regional section. This is the line starting all the way from the northwestern margin. The southwestern margin of the basin, all the way towards like the northeastern margin, closer to that left lateral structural fault that I mentioned earlier. So you can see that, it's very intensely deformed. Again, like, the center part of this regional line is still like, very well preserved with thick Cenozoic sediments. But overall, you can tell that, the western part of the basin is more deep into all of this shallow deformation are actually connected to the basement thrust fault that are deep into the southwest. While to the northeastern corner, eventually all the deformation roots to those basement thrust fault that are deep into the northeast. Again, this is a 3D perspective of the same line, where you see that, internally you got that hill range within the basin that I mentioned about, that got an explorer, like, of the older rock. But internally, this is like, the basin side and closer to the mountain range. So eventually, all of this basement thrust faults connects to the side of the basin through the mountain range. So I won't go into all the detail, but the line that I showed earlier was that northwestern most line. But this is a 3D perspective again of the whole basin, where we have the, we really utilize some of these regional sections. Most of these sections are 100 kilometers wide length. And then, like, you can say the general deformation style is that, it's much more complexly deformed in the northwestern corner, where, it also got like the Altenpark and also the Quinlan, the other, the eastern Quinlan structurally fault getting closer. While towards the eastern side, where you got a little bit expansion of the basin and also a much thicker, younger sediments, as you can observe, like, the much lighter color, where you see a little bit presence in the western side, they become much thicker in the eastern side. So you basically get like the depth center that migrating from the western side towards the eastern side throughout the Cenozoic period. But overall, it's still consistent that, across this dashed line boundary, to the western side or to the southwestern side, the deformation, no matter how it changes in the shallow side, eventually roots to the faults that are deep into the southwest. While to the northeastern of this boundary line, the deformation eventually roots to the basement thrust fault that are deep towards the northeast. So this is kind of, how we define the basin architecture, really understanding, like, some of the structural style changes across the basin, but still seeing this consistent, regional deformation style. Next, I will touch upon the deformation timing of the structures, and, further expand on into the implications for our understanding of the regional tectonics here. So here we really utilize the growth strata that I already touched upon a bit earlier. But again, this is a structural wedge model, where you see that, within the per growth strata is more isopachus. Within the growth strata, you can identify some of the unique structure, for example, this growth triangle zone, or some of the, some of the changes across the axial surface that eventually connects to the, where there's a change of the fault, the fault tip here. So coming back to the basin, where there are like more than 140 structures, I analyzed quite a over 100 structures individually, along with those regional lines, where this is an example of one structure, where you can see that, more or less isopachus in the deeper sequence. While you start to document the existence of this like, growth strata, up until from this purple layer, where you have the thinning upward towards the edge of this structure. So this is actually where we started defining the age of the deformation based on the growth strata. Here is like, the about 40 million years ago. Again, this is coming a little bit eastward, where actually this structure documents two phases of deformation. You start to have this initial phase of deformation that is about 40 million years ago. And then you got like one layer in between 40 to about 22 million years. It's very isopachus. So it seems to be there's a deformation quiescence during this time period, while you start to see more dramatic growth strata formation since like this 22 million years ago. Moving further east, you see kind of like, this is also kind of getting to the center of the basin, but more or less you see that there's barely any like thickness change in the very eastern side in the deeper layers. The growth strata only started to form since about 20 million years ago. Similar story towards the eastern side. This is actually slightly different that, you got some of the thickening trend towards the southern side. So potentially indicating that, you don't really have much deformation coming from the structural fault yet. So this is a kind of different deformation regime. But overall, if we look at the shallower sequence, it's still like, the major deformation started about 22 million years ago. So with this kind of analysis, we say that, we try to plot this individual structure mainly along the regional line, even though I did like analyze some of the other lines not on this regional line. But overall, that you see I didn't really talk in detail, but then like the T0 is like the reflector. So basically, the smaller number are the much younger sequence. So larger number are the older sequence. So basically, you can see the trend that the western side of the basin is much earlier deformed. That started about 40 million years ago. While if the deformation kind of seems to be migrating eastward, and about 22 million years ago, there seems to be more consistent deformation all the way like from the western side into the eastern area. While the kind of the most recent deformation, the quaternary deformation, more or less constrained on the eastern side of the basin. That's actually where also the depth center of this basin sediments are. So overall, that you see kind of there are two major phases of deformation. The early phase of 40 million years ago, that are more or less in the western side, where it's more intensely deformed. While the second phase of deformation that started about 20 million years ago, that exists across the basin. So coming back to the regional tectonics here, this Eocene deformation that's we saw here in this part of the basin about 40 million years ago is actually not unique to this basin. Some of the other studies around this northern margin of the plateau in other basins actually also saw this potential similar age of Eocene deformation that happened in the northern part of the plateau. Well, just to remind you again that the current thinking of the Indo-Eurasian plate, Eurasian collision started about 15 million years ago. So it seems that it's not too far away, not too far after the initial collision. You actually started already having that northern part of the base of the plateau that probably under the far field effect that started deforming. I'm not including the example here, but we do see some of the potential, like some of the initial normal faults that could exist in this part of the basin that forms the initiation point of those deformation. So it's really under those kind of far field tectonic effect, along with some of the older weak planes that decided to form the deformation within the northern side of the Tibetan Plateau. While this kind of more recent 20 million years or 22 million years of deformation that I just showed that are more expensive in this basin, it's actually also document that throughout the whole plateau or into like the further beyond the plateau, this is like further getting into this is the Tian Shan range, where some of the more like some of the more recent study understanding like the uplifting history also documented this phase of deformation that started about 20 million years ago. While like further eastward into the Sichuan Basin, where there's also active exploration efforts going on, there's like a good record of like the study of the deformation structure, both from the surface geology along with some of the seismic data and the wall control. You also see the phase of deformation that is about 20 million years ago. So overall, you call that like a very widespread 20 million years ago, there's a deformation expanding across the plateau or even beyond the plateau proper. So this is my final slide before I come to the conclusion. Basically, a cartoon figure modified beyond some of the initial work, by Paul Tavernier of the concept of escape tectonics. So basically, from 15 million years ago to 22 million years ago, you started to have the initial deformation, but you also got the Indo-China block that are escaping southward, along with some of the large structural fault here. So that's actually where you see kind of the propagation, the deformation from this regional collision started to propagate northward. But in the meantime, the northern side of the basin probably started deforming much earlier, about 40 million years ago. And then like by 22 million years ago, that's actually the point this major structural faults start to be active. While you notice that, the Indo-China block, the escape tectonics of that block stopped with the reversal of the structural fault here. While the South China block was also kind of starting expanding, and then really expanding, driving the expansion of the major tectonics in this area. So basically, the deformation within the Qaidam Basin recorded this two-stage of deformation, from this more north-south convergent tectonics to this more easternward escape tectonics. So with that, the conclusion that we draw from this study is that first we can interpret and model this kind of the series structure in the basin, try to build this regional balanced and retrodeformable cross section, and to understand the basin scale models, and also to explore some of the new methodologies to interpret this data, building upon some of the more conventional fault-fault relationships. And secondly, we document this new class of contractional fault-related folding, which is the basement involved structural wedges in the basin. And we also employ some method really constraining the horizon relief to distinguish these structural wedges from the more typical fault-related faults. And thirdly, we model the kinematics of the structural wedge, using the inclined shear algorithm, and really that helps us define the fault thrust and some of the lower elements of the structure. And then, we are able to apply this structure observation into more regional interpretation, and try to constrain that the basin architecture that eventually the basin is controlled by those faults that are basement rooted and deepening faults both southwest and northeast near the basin margin. And eventually these faults root beneath those major mountain ranges on the margin of the basin. And again, as I documented through both the deformation timing and also the deformation intensity across the basin, that you see that it's really kind of the mountain range along with the thrust fault, the structural faults on the side of the basin that actually initiated deformation in the northwestern side, and then gradually drove the deformation or the migration of depth center towards the eastern side of the basin. And finally, the deformation in this Qaidam Basin recorded the two phases of the regional tectonics, from the initial north-south convergent tectonics to the escape tectonics. With that, this is just some further reference in case you are interested for some of the more detailed observations in the basin. With that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Yanpeng. That was a wonderful talk. For anyone with questions, please submit them to the Q&A section, and Yanpeng can go through and answer them in order. Yanpeng, I'll pass it to you. It looks like we already have 2 questions in the chat.
Let me see. Oh, yeah, got it. Let me see. Let me read them. The first question. Sorry, let me just read them through and now.
If you'd prefer, I can read them out loud to you, and so the whole group hears it.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Prasad asks, hi, Yanpeng. I appreciate your excellent presentation and the impressive work you've done. The model seems promising for identifying different faults. I'm curious if there's a parametric approach to determining which faults are more likely to lead to issues and which ones are not. It might be a bit outside the scope, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Maybe some relation with high normal stresses.
Thanks for the question, Prasad. Just to clarify, when you say lead to issues, are you referring to any of the seismic hazards, or what kind of issues are you referring to? Or even the constraint of the fault geometry here? Not sure if you can just if you can mute Prasad. Let me see. Oh, sorry. Hey, Prasad, I just unmute you. So if can you just clarify on this?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just referring to the it's like all faults won't bleed, right? So if there are high normal stresses, those faults may not bleed, and that won't cause any issues with the reservoirs. So I'm trying to draw an analogous conclusion based on this one.
Oh, you mean like for the reservoir quality side?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. I think our study didn't really cover into that scope of the reservoir scale. But then there's indeed when we interact with our industry collaborators in those mainly in that wedge section where previously we didn't really define the deformation there, it's actually more intensely deformed. So indeed the current exploration efforts also go into some of the footwall section that we defined there. So that's potential some of the implications within the wedge. That's actually as you can imagine that it's kind of undergoes two phases of deformation coming from both the fault itself and also the back thrust here.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick note, anyone with hands up, please, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A. Thanks. Okay, Paul Genovese had commented, brilliant presentation, Yanpeng. What do we know about the basement lithologies in terms of fabric, pre-existing zones of weakness that localize and orient faults? Do GravMag data tell us anything about basement structural fabric?
Thank you, Paul. These are brilliant questions. I think you touched upon something that we didn't get the time to do, really understanding some of the basement fabric here. But indeed, actually, I think I have a backup slide for some of the pre-existing weakness, more in the Cenozoic sediments, not in the basement. But let me actually quickly flip to that slide. Just fun. So this is actually one example where you can see that you got that expansive section about within that wedge system. Along that hanging wall, you got that deeper interval that actually thickens towards that shallow thrust fault. So this actually was one of the examples. Actually, you got another example here that we did also the modeling there. So you can actually see that there are indeed some of the initial normal fault that you can constrain from the shallower sediments that extends into the basement. Unfortunately, we did not cover into the fabric into the basement, how that deformed. But from this kind of evidence, we do see that there might be some of the initial weak zone that are already there that are documented from that sediments that thickens towards the interval. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks. Gary Prost asked, so have you ruled out any early Paleocene, Eocene extensional phase to explain some of the growth seen in the older units just above basement that may have later been inverted?
Yeah, this is actually probably a good slide to continue with the conversation. So I do, I'm actually go back to the previous one, sorry. Yeah, as I mentioned briefly, I think we do, the example I showed earlier didn't really include this thickening interval, where we say it's more full thrust, back thrust combination, but it's really through these other examples where you see the core parts being thickening towards that shallow thrust fault. We do see that potential, Paleocene, Eocene early deformation that are later inverted. But it's not only this, it's not like a simple inversion. It's actually depending on what kind of stress mechanism that is. It's actually the combination of the inversion along with that a full thrust that controls the system. Yeah, moving to the next one.
Okay, Steve Naruk said, great talk. Interesting that the basement faults are all planar. Analogous basement structures in the Rockies and ancestral Rockies have dominantly listric faults.
Yeah, thank you for the comments, Steve. Yeah, I will follow up with you on this. This definitely seems interesting to compare with this. One thing that I did not get the time to touch into was that because there are still active earthquakes. So actually, after our finished study, interpret some of the faults in the basement, there was one active earthquake we call the focal mechanism mutation that actually match very perfectly in terms of both the depth and the deep angle of the fault. So that's actually some nice ways to calibrate with our study in the deeper sides in terms of this planar basement fault. Yeah, next.
All right. Martin Reyes said, thanks for the nice talk. I'm just curious, what is your reason to draw high angle faults, especially in areas with lack of good seismic imaging?
I mean, some of the high angle faults in the shallower side, I think that's based on the observation from the seismic. I only showed some of the like regional line, but when we interpret the structure here, we did get either more dense 2D lines across the structure to help us constrain that fault geometry. But for the deeper ones that are not, you cannot really directly say, those are actually more constrained by the shallower geometry. It's really you need that setup in order to really explain the shallower fault geometry, because eventually it's balance system that things need to be explained by the initial displacement.
Okay, any more comments or questions for Yanpeng? Please submit them, or you can also reach out to him afterwards, I would think. And just for reference, we will be posting this recording to our YouTube page for you to go back and review again. All right, a lot of applause and thumbs up. Not seeing any other questions come in. So again, thank you, Yanpeng. This was an excellent talk, very insightful, and we appreciate it. And we'll be looking to keep an eye out for future webinars. Oops, I think one more came in. Just thanks so much, Yanpeng. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you again for the invitation, and thank you all for your attention.
All right, everyone, have a good day, and we will see you again soon.
Okay, bye.
All right.